Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission here is, well, it's pretty simple. We take a whole stack of dense sources. We're talking historical texts, new research, philosophical arguments, and we pull out the essential knowledge you need to be, truly well-informed.
And today, we are wrestling with a narrative that is, it's arguably the most influential in all of Western history.
No kidding. This is a story that has drawn borders, written laws, and defined morality for 2,000 years. It governs the lives of, nearly a third of the world's population today.
Yeah, the sheer scale of it makes its origin story feel almost untouchable, sacred even.
Okay, so let's unpack that. We're talking about the origin story of Christianity. And look, we want to be clear. We deeply respect the personal faith of billions of people. But the sources we've put together for this deep dive, they suggest a really powerful, complex, and frankly, politically driven interpretation.
They really do. The sources argue that while Christianity might be the greatest story ever told, there's this massive an imperial plot twist lurking right in the historical background.
A plot twist. I like that. So what is it?
The core claim we're digging into today is a radical one. It's that the foundational author of this global religion wasn't the man we know as Jesus of Nazareth.
Okay.
Instead, the sources argue that the real architecture of the religion, the thing that made it a global power, was designed, refined, and very aggressively implemented by the very empire that executed him.
By the Roman Empire.
By the Roman Empire.
Okay, that completely shifts the lens in the last 2,000 years. If the central figure was a Jew fighting Rome, and the religion that came out of it was actually engineered by Rome, then our mission for this deep dive is pretty clear.
It is. We have to peel back all these layers of myth, of political strategy, of, ancient religious warfare, and the very real blood that was spilled by empires.
To get to the truth that's buried underneath all of it.
Exactly. And our sources don't just live in history books. They blend this deep ancient history and political strategy with something much, much older, something primordial, astronomical and cosmological observation. To really understand the story, you first have to understand the sky. So we're going to start by showing just how deeply these cosmic cycles and pre-existing pagan beliefs were strategically baked into what we now accept as sacred history.
So let's jump right in there with the myth-making process itself. And we should probably start with the most iconic, maybe the most sentimental scene imaginable. The Nativity. It's the image we all know, right? The bright star hanging over a humble manger in Bethlehem. You've got shepherds, and critically, the three wise men who are following that star to witness a miraculous virgin birth.
It feels incredibly spiritual, doesn't it? It's presented as this unique historical, a once-in-all-of-history event.
But the challenge our sources bring up is that, well, if you just set aside the spiritual meaning for a second and look at the actual mechanics of the story, you realize this isn't history happening on Earth.
It's an astronomical allegory, written in the winter sky and borrowed wholesale from much, much older traditions.
Okay, that feels like a big leap. Walk us through the evidence. How do the sources bridge that gap between just looking at stars and the actual nativity scene?
Right, so what's fascinating is how universal these symbols were to ancient cultures.
Yeah.
These are people who relied on reading the sky for everything, for agriculture, for navigation, for telling time.
It was their science.
It was their science and their religion, all in one. So let's look at the three wise men. The sources argue these are not historical kings or dignitaries. They are celestial markers. They correspond perfectly to the three bright stars that form the belt of the constellation Orion.
Orion's belt. Mintaka, Elunalem, and Alnitak. Yeah, they're unmistakable. Some of the brightest stars you can see in the northern hemisphere. That connection it's immediate.
It's visually immediate, exactly. So now we have our three wise men. What about the star in the east they're following?
What is it?
That star is Sirius, also known as Alpha Canis Majoris. It is the single brightest star in the entire night sky.
Okay, so you have Orion's belt and Sirius. How does this all come together?
The celestial arrangement on December 25th is the crucial piece of the puzzle here. Ancient astronomers all over the world noticed that on the night of December 24th, a very specific, very powerful alignment happens.
And what's the alignment?
The three stars of Orion's belt are three wise men. They form a perfect line. And that line points directly toward the position on the eastern horizon where Sirius rises.
Okay.
And then, on the morning of December 25th, that entire configuration, the three stars, pointing to Sirius aligns perfectly to mark the exact location of the sunrise.
Oh, wow. So the three wise men following the star to the birth, it's a literal visual alignment in the sky.
It is. They are pointing to the birth of the sun, The sources say this symbolizes the birth of God's S-U-N, not S-O-N.
The sun, not the sun.
It's an ancient solar-based allegory that was just disguised as a biographical human event. This was the language of ancient civilizations, from Babylon to Egypt to Rome. They tracked time and divine cycles by projecting these predictable cosmic patterns onto human stories. It made the story feel profound, eternal, because it mirrored the universe itself.
It's incredible. We sort of treat ancient people like they were simple, but the intellectual sophistication to track these things so precisely, it's not magic, it was their cosmology.
It was everything.
But that raises the big question, why December 25th? We know that's the date, but why did the Roman Church ultimately pick that day to anchor this whole event? Was it just arbitrary?
Not at all. The choice of December 25th is probably some of the strongest evidence for this whole appropriation theory. The date lands right in the middle of the celebration of the winter solstice, a period celebrated by pagan cultures all across the Mediterranean for millennia before Christianity even existed.
The sun dies, right? That's the core idea.
That's exactly it. If you're an ancient person and you're tracking the sun's movement from summer onwards, you notice it travels lower and further south in the sky every day.
Shorter days, colder weather.
Right. And for 3 critical days, from December 22nd to the 24th, the ancients saw that the sun appeared to just stop.
Yeah.
It halts its southern movement. It pauses at the lowest, weakest point on the horizon.
And if your entire life depends on the sun, for warmth, for light, for crops, that 3-day pause must have felt like a terrifying, impending death. It's the moment of maximum darkness.
It was the literal darkest point of the year, the death of the sun. But then on the 25th, the miracle happens. The celebration. The sun begins its journey north again. It starts to climb higher, bringing longer days, more warmth, and the promise that spring and life will return.
It's reborn, or resurrected.
It is quite literally resurrected.
So if we just connect that annual solar cycle to the story of a savior who dies for 3 days and is then resurrected, you see, the core story isn't a one-time miracle.
It's the annual predictable cycle of the sun, celebrated globally. In Rome, they called him Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. In Egypt, you had Horus. The Persian god Mithras was also a solar deity. The pattern was everywhere.
So the core theme, death and resurrection, coinciding with the solstice. It was already a fixture in mythology across the entire region. Osiris, Dionysus, Mithras. It establishes this pattern long before the figure of Jesus even enters the historical record.
Right, and that's crucial. The sources argue that what's going on here is less about a specific man's miracles and more about repackaging a deep cosmic truth that humanity already understood intuitively. It made the new story instantly resonant.
Okay, so if the foundation of the story is this astronomical allegory, then we have to turn to the man at the center of it all, the historical figure. Let's try to put aside the heavily edited, often contradictory biblical accounts and find the actual Jewish rebel the sources say existed.
First thing we have to do is challenge the common image. Just forget the pale-skinned, long-haired, sort of ethereal-looking guy.
The Hollywood Jesus.
The Hollywood Jesus, exactly. The Superman-like savior. That image is a composite created much, much later. It reflects European art and ideals, and it was designed to look absolutely nothing like a first-century Judean peasant.
So the historical reality, if he existed, was probably much grittier.
Far more immediate. He would have been a humble Jewish man, speaking Aramaic, likely a laborer whose mission was intensely local. Fix the corruption in his own community and free his people from oppression.
And his background is key to understanding that, right? The sources mention the Essenes.
Yes. Historical clues, especially from things like the Dead Sea Scrolls and other texts outside the official canon, they strongly suggest he was trained by the Essenes. This was a mysterious ascetic sect of mystics who lived outside Jerusalem, often in desert communities.
What were they all about? What did they believe?
They were religious purists. They rejected the temple priesthood in Jerusalem as corrupt, as illegitimate. They were very apocalyptic in their worldview. They believed the great spiritual and political cleansing was coming, and soon.
So a pretty radical group.
Extremely. Their training involved rigorous purification rituals, communal living, and a deep, deep study of Scripture. This gave their followers immense moral authority, but it also put them in direct opposition to the entire religious establishment.
And this training would have given the historical Jesus both that spiritual authority and a very critical eye for hypocrisy and injustice.
Exactly, which leads to his original goal. According to this analysis, it was never to start a new, separate global religion called Christianity.
No.
Absolutely not. He was fundamentally a Jew trying to reform Judaism. His fight was, you could say, threefold. a political critique against Rome's brutal occupation and taxes, a theological critique against the wealthy, corrupt temple elite, and a social critique demanding revolutionary compassion for the poor and the outcast.
So he was a genuine revolutionary, a political firebrand as much as a spiritual teacher.
It's the only conclusion that makes sense of his death. Crucifixion was the Roman punishment reserved almost exclusively for political enemies, for revolutionaries, for seditionists.
Yeah.
Not for guys just talking about the afterlife.
Rome wouldn't have cared about that.
They wouldn't have cared at all. His execution basically confirms the source's claim that he was seen as a clear and present danger to Roman order.
But hold on, if he was a revolutionary fighting Rome, how did the sources explain the teachings of nonviolence? You know, turn the other cheek, or render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Those quotes seem to be the complete opposite of a political firebrand.
That is a critical question, and the sources offer a couple of explanations, both highly political. The first is that the texts we have today were compiled and edited after Rome hijacked the movement. So it's highly probable that the more overtly militant or politically charged rhetoric of the original movement, which might have sounded more like the Zealots, was systematically edited out or softened by Roman-backed editors. They needed to make the final story palatable, non-threatening to the empire.
So they defanged the subversive political message.
Precisely. Turn the other cheek might have started as a radical form of spiritual resistance, a refusal to sink to the oppressor's level of violence, but Rome later marketed it as passive submission.
And what about render unto Caesar?
The second explanation is that, in context, that was a trap. The Pharisees were trying to get him to either endorse the hated Roman tax or advocate for tax evasion, which was sedition, by saying, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's," and pointing to the coin with the emperor's face on it. He was subtly reminding his Jewish audience that the coin itself was a symbol of idolatry and corruption, something they should want to reject anyway.
Yeah.
It was a brilliant political escape, not an endorsement of Roman rule.
Got it. So regardless of the nuance, the powers that be, the local Jewish elite who collaborated with Rome and the Roman administration itself, they saw him as an existential threat.
They saw him as the spark that could light a massive, uncontrollable fire. And the sources suggest they successfully conspired to silence him. They killed the man, believing that execution was the guaranteed way to stamp out the movement for good.
But that was their fatal error, wasn't it?
It was their fatal strategic error. They could not kill the idea, the teachings of resistance, of radical love, of equality. They spread like wildfire among the oppressed, the slaves, the poor, all across the Roman Empire.
His execution just created the ultimate martyr. The movement, instead of dying, went underground. It gained this powerful new narrative, and it just began to grow exponentially, fueled by the very brutality the empire was using against it.
Which brings us to the great strategic pivot point in the 4th century.
Right, because for the first few hundred years after he was executed, Rome just stuck to its old playbook, crushed the movement with force.
And their attempts were legendarily brutal. We all know the stories. Spectacular suppression, throwing Christians to the lions in the Colosseum, torture, burnings. They tried everything they could to eradicate this highly disciplined, rapidly spreading movement that just fundamentally threatened the Roman social order.
But it wasn't working. The sources are clear on that. The more they persecuted, the more the numbers grew. The decentralized grassroots nature of the faith made it incredibly resilient.
It seemed like every martyr just inspired 10 new converts. They were proving that brutality alone was not going to work.
And this is where we see the sophisticated, cold, and utterly pragmatic political genius of Rome really kick in.
Yes. They realized their strategy of extermination was just feeling the beast. And if you can't beat a rising power, the only logical imperial move left is to co-opt it, control it, and most importantly, redefine it. The empire decided to hijack the movement.
And this is when Emperor Constantine comes on the scene. We have to challenge that traditional story of his divine vision before a battle, right?
The sources are very clear. Constantine's decision to endorse and eventually adopt Christianity was not a spiritual conversion as we think of it. It was a cold, calculated move for political control.
You have to look at the context of the early 4th century. The Roman Empire was collapsing under its own weight.
It was. It was too vast, too economically fractured, too politically diverse. Diocletian had already tried splitting it up to the Tetrarchy, and that just led to more civil war. Constantine desperately needed a system that could unite all these different peoples and legions and geographies under one single, unwavering authority.
And the old gods, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, they just couldn't do that job anymore. They were local guides, tied to specific cities or aspects of Roman life. It was a fragmented system for an empire that desperately needed cohesion.
Precisely. Constantine needed a single universal glue that could transcend local traditions. And he found it in this growing, highly organized, and surprisingly centralized new faith. By adopting it, he didn't become its servant, he became its editor-in-chief, its patron, its ultimate administrative head. The political need dictated the theology, not the other way around.
Which brings us to the defining moment where the story is officially edited and standardized. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD.
Yeah, and we're taught to think of this as this holy spiritual conference.
But the sources see something very different.
They vehemently disagree. They characterize Nicaea as an editorial meeting. And it wasn't even convened by religious leaders. It was convened by the emperor himself. Constantine needed a unified official version of Christianity, and he needed it now. This was where all the conflicting theological views were brutally suppressed and standardized.
The big one was Arianism versus Trinitarianism, right? Can you just quickly break down what was at stake there?
Sure. Arianism, led by a priest named Arius, argued that Jesus was created by God the Father and was therefore subordinate to him. He wasn't co-eternal or co-equal with God. It was logical, pretty easy to understand.
Okay.
Trinitarianism, on the other hand, argued for the much more complex idea of the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as three persons in one divine substance. Theologically, it's confusing, but politically, it was incredibly powerful.
How does that theological difference become a political tool?
Well, think about it. If Jesus is subordinate, as the Arians believed, then the earthly leaders who claim authority through him, the bishops and the emperor, are also subordinate. Their authority is limited. But if Jesus is co-equal and co-eternal with God, as the Trinitarians argued, then the earthly institution that represents him, the church, and by extension, the emperor who is its ultimate protector, wields absolute, unquestionable divine authority.
And Constantine needed maximum authority to hold his collapsing empire together.
He needed the Trinitarian dogma, and he enforced it. So they weren't deciding on eternal truth at Nicaea, they were creating the official textbook for the new state religion, making sure it served the imperial function of absolute centralized power.
It was a massive state-sponsored synthesis project.
That's a perfect way to put it. They took popular pagan myths people already believed, combined them with Jewish texts to give the faith historical depth, and layered on Greek philosophy to make it sound scholarly. The result was a unified, coherent, and crucially politically useful story.
And the most profound change was for the man himself. They took this historical Jewish rebel and elevated him to a divine cosmic god.
They had to. A mere executed revolutionary wasn't grand enough to unite an empire. They needed a figure who could replace the old gods, but still feel familiar. Remember, Romans were already comfortable with divine figures who had miraculous powers and virgin births. So they turned him into a cosmic god compatible with their existing pantheon. It was the ultimate act of political rebranding.
So once that synthesis was done at Nicaea, the next move was to make this new religion seem like it had always been there, like it was original.
Exactly. And this is where we see the really intense and, frankly, obvious pagan appropriation. Our sources point out all these suspicious resemblances that have been hiding in plain sight for centuries.
It's like the church, under Roman direction, didn't actually erase paganism at all?
No, it just performed a masterclass in rebranding. They took beloved local festivals and powerful solar gods, they renamed them, and they just gave them new Christian meanings.
Let's run through some of the specific examples from the sources. What about the miracles? The famous miracle of turning water into wine, where did that come from?
That was the established miracle of Dionysus, the Greek god of wine and ecstasy. Sources note that temples to Dionysus often told stories of him turning water into wine for his followers. This is an archetype that predates the Christian story by centuries. Its inclusion in the Gospels looks like a very suspicious coincidence.
Or a very conscious marketing decision.
More likely, yes. A way to appeal to a population that already knew and loved that story.
And the virgin birth, which is so central to the whole thing, that was also anything but unique.
That's right. The idea of a savior born from a virgin or divine mother was everywhere. The sources point to the Egyptian god Horus, whose mother Isis was often depicted as a virgin, and crucially, the Persian god Mithras, who was wildly popular with the Roman army. He was also said to have been born of a virgin on December 25th in a cave.
These were active competing religions at the time?
Very active. So this sounds less like a unique revelation and more like absorbing the features of your most popular competitors into your own brand. It's a necessary move if you want to replace them seamlessly. The average person in the 4th century didn't have to fundamentally change their yearly celebrations, just the names of the figures they were celebrating.
Even the holidays we still have today show this. Take Halloween.
The sources trace Halloween's origin directly back to the Celtic festival of Samhain. This was a huge pagan holiday, marking the end of the harvest, the beginning of the dark half of the year, a time when the veil between the worlds was thin. The church just took that deep, cyclical observance and slapped the name All Saints' Day on top of it, making it about their holy dead instead of the natural dead.
And Easter, the single most important theological holiday celebrating the resurrection. The sources claim it wasn't originally about an empty tomb at all.
Spot on. The word Easter itself is likely derived from Eostra, a Germanic goddess of spring and fertility. It was a pagan festival celebrating the return of life after the winter death.
Which explains the bunnies and the eggs.
It explains the bunnies and the eggs. They are universal symbols of fertility and spring renewal. They have absolutely nothing to do with the resurrection of Jesus, except that the church grafted its story onto this existing, incredibly popular celebration of spring. It made the switch from pagan to Christian easy for everybody.
It's a complete absorption. The church takes the competitors' features, renames the old gods, gives them new halos, and the sources say this symbolism isn't just in the stories. We can find physical evidence of it in the architecture of the Vatican itself.
The physical evidence is maybe the most compelling, because you can't argue with it. Just look at St. Peter's Square in Rome. Architectural analysis shows it's literally designed as a giant sundial, an astronomical clock, using the obelisk in the center as the pointer. It's a monumental piece of solar architecture.
And that obelisk in the center, it's an actual Egyptian obelisk.
Yes, a massive monument that Emperor Caligula brought over from Egypt in the 1st century. It originally stood in Heliopolis, the city of the sun, and it was explicitly dedicated to the sun god, Ra.
And now it's in the center of St. Peter's Square,
marking the very spot where early Christians were martyred. The irony is just staggering. The spiritual heart of Christianity is marked by this gigantic, undeniable monument to the sun god. It's not an accident. It's a deliberate statement of imperial synthesis.
And it continues in all the art. The halos.
The halos. Those golden rings around the heads of saints in thousands of paintings. That's the sun disk, plain and simple, taken directly from solar gods all across the Middle East.
Right.
Even the most holy day of the week, Sunday, it retains that explicit link to the solar worship that was central to Roman cults. The symbolism isn't hidden, it's hiding in plain sight, because the builders never even felt the need to remove it.
But this manufactured story, this political consolidation, it came at a really heavy price for humanity. Once the papacy solidified its control as the gatekeeper of the synthesized truth, it fundamentally changed the course of human development for centuries.
What came next was the systematic suppression that we call the Dark Ages. The papacy, armed with a state religion that demanded absolute obedience, it basically acted as a bottleneck for human progress. Because the entire power structure relied on this fixed, undisputed narrative from Nicaea, anything that challenged that narrative had to be eliminated, immediately and brutally.
And it wasn't just stamping out heresy. They burned books that had alternative histories or scientific ideas from the classical world. They silenced scientists who dared to observe the universe in a way that contradicted the fixed, Earth-centric theological view.
I mean, think about the massive loss of classical knowledge. The sources estimate that huge parts of what was in the Library of Alexandria, sophisticated medical texts, astronomical knowledge, engineering, it was either destroyed or just allowed to vanish because it contradicted the new theologically mandated worldview.
And it extended to medicine, too, the witch hunts.
Yes, they hunted so-called witches, who were often just people, usually women, practicing ancient folk medicine or herbalism. Their knowledge bypassed the church's authority, so they had to be eliminated.
The historical cost, as the sources claim, was the Dark Ages. We just lost centuries of momentum. Historians estimate this systematic suppression set humanity back by at least 300 to 500 years. Imagine where we'd be today if centuries of classical knowledge hadn't been deliberately destroyed or locked away out of religious fear.
And that fear, of course, was the whole point. It was the mechanism of control. An ignorant, fearful population is infinitely easier to govern than an educated one. Fear stopped people from questioning, and the only authorized source of truth was the very institution that created the story and claimed to hold the keys to salvation.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me, because it connects this whole narrative back to the verifiable historical record, or I guess the startling lack of a record. We are talking about the height of the Roman Empire, the most meticulously documented bureaucracy in the ancient world.
Rome documented everything, with obsessive detail. They kept these incredibly thorough records of daily grain shipments, every census, every legal case, every execution order. They were masters of administration.
Yet, for a figure who supposedly walked on water, fed thousands, raised the dead, and was executed by order of a high-ranking Roman official, Pontius Pilate, the history books from his actual lifetime are just strangely, profoundly silent.
That is the paradox the sources highlight, and it really undermines the claim of his massive public prominence during his life. There are no official Roman records of Jesus from his actual lifetime, no trial transcripts, no execution orders in the archives, and no Roman historian writing in the 30s AD, when these miracles were supposed to be happening, mentions him at all.
For a man who caused so much public unrest that he had to be executed, the silence from the primary historical source, Rome, is deafening.
The history books only start mentioning him decades later, and even then it's often through these brief, sometimes contested secondhand accounts.
Right, the references in Tacitus or Josephus?
Exactly. They date from the late 1st century, decades after the events, and they mostly just mention Christians as this problematic new sect, or make these brief, maybe later edited references to a historical founder. The timeline suggests the figure was politically obscure until the movement around him had grown, allowing the myth to be built up decades after his death.
The gap in the documentation really does lend massive credence to the idea that the figure was transformed and elevated over time, rather than being this huge, divine figure during his actual life.
His prominence grew after his death, through narrative construction and imperial necessity, and today, after 1,700 years of cultural and political consolidation, that imperial spell is finally breaking.
The sources suggest that as information becomes democratized, free and easily accessible to everyone through the internet, the old stories, when you place them side by side with historical and astronomical facts, they just hold less water for a lot of people.
And you can see the result, especially in the very places where Christianity was forged, in Europe and North America. We're seeing this significant rise in atheism, agnosticism, and deism as people are actively stepping away from the codified institutional religion.
But at the same time, the sources acknowledge that belief persists. Even when you're confronted with this powerful historical evidence of political editing, people still cling to the comfort of the fable, the moral structure, the community the story provides.
The need for a universal, comforting narrative remains this incredibly powerful force in human nature. It's a tension between the intellectual realization of what happened historically and that deep human need for meaning and belonging.
So what does this all mean for us? If we pull all this analysis together, what's the core finding of this deep dive?
I think the core finding is pretty clear. The specific development of the Christian narrative was a masterful, complex, multi-century piece of political and cultural synthesis. It was driven not by spontaneous divine revelation, but by imperial necessity. The cold, hard requirement to use religion as a political glue to hold a collapsing empire together.
And this pattern of human hands, of political maneuvering, of cultural appropriation, transforming an original spiritual message, that seems to be the key universal takeaway here. It shows us exactly how power structures operate, even with transcendent ideas. The message starts pure, but the packaging has to serve the institution.
It really raises an important question, doesn't it? Why do human institutions feel this constant need to standardize, to edit, and to control these messages? The process of turning a revolutionary's local teachings into a universal, state-controllable dogma seems to be this inherent drive of empires.
And before we get too comfortable just pointing fingers at Rome for this, the sources remind us this pattern isn't unique to Christianity at all.
Not at all. It happened earlier to Judaism, when it went from a nomadic faith to a centralized system with temple authority. It happened here, and the sources explicitly state that this exact same pattern of political reshaping happened to the third major Abrahamic faith, Islam, as well.
The transformation of a message by political necessity is a recurring, almost cyclical theme in human history, especially when a spiritual movement gains real power.
It is.
And that leaves us with a truly provocative thought for you to mull over as you process all of this. How does the necessity for political control inevitably reshape even the most transcendent spiritual messages? Once power and prominence and control become part of the conversation, can a revolutionary spiritual message ever really stay pure and unedited?
A vital question to consider as you reflect on the source material we've discussed today and the history it reveals.
And if you found this deep dive compelling, then we really encourage you to join us next time. We're going to turn our analytical lens to that third major Abrahamic faith. We will ask the hard historical questions about the religion of nearly 2 billion people today, Islam, and explore how its message, much like those before it, was transformed and standardized by human hands and political necessity once again.
You will not want to miss that analysis.
Until then, keep digging and keep questioning the story.